Inside Leavenworth, the prison that trains America's criminal elite. The night was quiet inside Leavenworth, too quiet. An officer walking the tier froze when he noticed something strange. A group of inmates, men who belonged to different gangs, men who were never supposed to stand together, were huddled in a tight circle near the back of the rec yard. Their heads were down. Their hands moved fast. And whatever they were doing, they didn't want anyone to see it. When the officers stepped closer, they split apart like they'd practiced it 1,000 times. But on the ground, half covered in dirt, he saw something shine under the moonlight. A handmade metal tool. Not a shank. Not a lockpick. Something far more dangerous inside a place like Leavenworth. It was a perfectly shaped key. And in that moment, he realized the truth. Someone inside this prison was teaching these men skills they were never supposed to learn. Skills that belonged to trained criminals. Skills that could only come from someone who understood the prison better than anyone else. This was no accident. This was a classroom. A training ground. And Leavenworth was the school. The place that was supposed to break criminals was actually shaping them into something far more organized, far more dangerous, and far more unstoppable. The question now was simple. Who was teaching them? And what? The story begins. The prison that was supposed to fix everything. Leavenworth wasn't always a symbol of danger. When it was built, it was meant to be America's model prison. Big stone walls. Huge towers. Strict routines. Everything controlled. It was supposed to turn criminals into better people. But somewhere along the line, something changed. Inside those walls, inmates from every corner of America ended up living together. Bank robbers. Hackers, drug traffickers, gang members, even people who were experts in stealing cars, moving money, or running complicated schemes. And when you put thousands of intelligent, desperate men in the same place, they start sharing knowledge. At first, it was small things. One man would tell another how to hide a phone. Someone else would show a guy how to memorize officer routines. A new inmate might learn how to make a tattoo gun using a toothbrush and a motor from a broken fan. But Leavenworth had something most prisons didn't. Structure. A weird kind of order. And the men inside used it like a university classroom. There was a man named Curtis. Everyone called him Professor C. He wasn't a real teacher, but he'd run scams on the outside for 20 years. And in the yard, he'd sit on a bench with younger inmates, teaching them things like how to read financial statements, how to set up fake businesses, how to move money without being caught. Down in another unit, an older man named Red taught younger inmates how to get out of handcuffs using nothing but a paperclip. In the laundry room, inmates learned how to break down officers' schedules to the minute. And in the woodshop, that was where the real secrets were born. Some men learned to carve shapes out of scraps. Shapes that could become tools. Tools that could unlock doors. Inside Leavenworth, knowledge was the currency. And the smartest men became the most powerful ones. Officers saw it happening, but stopping it was harder than it looked. Because these men weren't causing fights. They weren't yelling or rioting. They were quiet, focused, organized. And that made them far more dangerous. Because inside Leavenworth, a new generation of criminals wasn't just surviving. They were upgrading. The secret classrooms of Leavenworth. The officers at Leavenworth always believed trouble came with noise, shouting, fights, chaos. But the real danger inside this prison didn't make a sound. It lived in the quiet places. The library, the workshop, the laundry room, even the yard benches where men sat with their heads down, pretending to play cards. These places became secret classrooms. No chalkboard, no books. Just whispered lessons and fast minds hungry for new skills. The library, where criminals studied like lawyers. The library wasn't large, but it was powerful. It held old law books, tax guides, business magazines, and thick manuals nobody on the outside would ever read. But inside, those books were gold. Inmates who barely finished middle school sat for hours, learning things like how to file appeals, how companies hide money, how contracts work, how to challenge evidence, how the federal system moves money from city to city. A small group gathered around one man named Lewis. He used to be an accountant, clean clothes, quiet voice. But behind that soft look, he knew how to move money like an artist. In the library, he taught inmates how to read numbers like they were reading a map. Where money came from, where it went, how it could disappear without anyone noticing. Some inmates didn't even know how to sign their name properly. Lewis taught them how to write checks, fill forms, and understand bank language. Inside those walls, he created financial criminals smarter than anyone expected. The workshop, where men built more than furniture. The woodshop smelled like dust, paint, and machine oil. Officially, inmates made desks, chairs, shelves, basic furniture sold to government buildings. Unofficially, it was one of Leavenworth's most dangerous training grounds. A man called Slick ran things there. He didn't run the room on paper, but everyone knew he was the boss. He taught younger inmates how to bend metal without breaking it, sharpen edges using sandpaper, shape wood with perfect precision, build things that didn't look like weapons, but were. A simple block of wood could become a tool. A metal scrap could turn into a lock bypass. Nothing left that workshop without Slick knowing exactly what it could be used for. The officers checked every piece. But inmates were smarter. They hid small mistakes inside big objects. A desk might have a hollow leg. A chair might have a secret compartment. A shelf might have a spot cut perfectly for hiding paper notes. Inside Leavenworth, furniture wasn't furniture. It was training. The laundry room, the heart of information. The laundry room seemed harmless. Men washed clothes, folded uniforms, pushed carts. But it was actually one of the most powerful places in the entire prison. Because laundry workers handled everything. Officers' uniforms, inmates' jumpsuits, sheets, towels, bags, notes hidden inside pockets, messages tucked inside socks, even tiny tools wrapped in shirts. One man named Dre knew every officer's schedule by the smell of their shirts, who sweated the most, who walked the most, who stayed still. He shared that knowledge quietly. Officer Green walks the East Tier at 7:10 every day. Officer Harris never checks the corner near the vents. Officer Blake always forgets to lock the back gate. Small facts. But in prison, small facts are powerful. Because in a place where freedom is impossible, information becomes freedom. The yard benches, the real university. This was where everything came together. Where the smartest inmates shared the lessons they'd learned through the day. Each bench had its own subject. One bench for building tools. One bench for learning legal tricks. One bench for understanding officer behavior. One bench for learning how gangs operate in different states. You could walk from one bench to another and learn more than any school on the outside. They weren't training to escape. They weren't training to fight. They were training to become the kind of criminals who made fewer mistakes and more moves. That was the danger. Leavenworth wasn't producing violent monsters. It was producing organized thinkers. Men who left prison knowing how to run something bigger than themselves. Some called it criminal college. Some called it the wrong kind of education. But everyone agreed on one thing. Leavenworth was teaching America's criminals to level up. The man behind the training. For months, officers at Leavenworth whispered the same question. Who's running all this? Because what they were seeing didn't look random. It looked planned. The inmates weren't just learning separate skills. They were learning in a pattern. A man who studied in the library would later move to the woodshop. Someone who learned officer schedules in the laundry room would later join the yard meetings. Guys who had never even spoken before were suddenly sharing knowledge like classmates. There had to be a leader. Someone pulling the strings. Someone smart enough to stay invisible. And eventually, a name started spreading through the prison. A name officers had heard before, but never paid attention to. Mr. Harlan. Who was Mr. Harlan? He wasn't loud. He wasn't violent. He wasn't even well known on the outside. But inside Leavenworth? He was a legend. Mr. Harlan was older, gray hair, calm voice, eyes that watched everything without moving. He walked slow, talked less, and thought more. No tattoos. No gang ties. No enemies. People said he used to run businesses, real ones, before he ended up in prison on a federal fraud case. But inside, he ran something different. He ran information. Every inmate seemed to know him. Every officer saw him, but nobody ever caught him doing anything wrong. He didn't lead a gang. He didn't lead a group. He led a network. And the way he did it was genius. Harlan's first rule: no violence. Harlan believed violence brought attention. And attention shut everything down. So he trained inmates to avoid fights, avoid yelling, avoid chaos. He wanted silence. Control. If two inmates argued, Harlan stepped in, not by force but by wisdom. He'd say things like, "Why fight when thinking gets you further? You learn nothing from anger." Inside Leavenworth, that made him powerful. Because power in prison usually comes from fear. But Harlan's power came from respect. Harlan's second rule: learn something every day. Every morning he picked a small group of men and sent them to different parts of the prison. One to the library, one to the workshop, one to the laundry room, one to the yard. At the end of the day, they all met back at the yard benches to share what they learned. It was like homework, but homework for survival. Homework for future plans. Harlan believed that knowledge was the most powerful thing inside a place where everything else was controlled. You couldn't choose your food. You couldn't choose your room. You couldn't choose your job. But you could choose what you learned. And Harlan made sure his people learned everything. Harlan's third rule: think like the outside. Most inmates think only about the next meal, the next day, the next argument. Not Harlan. He trained men to think like people running a business. Your time here is temporary, he'd say. Your mind is forever. He taught them how to plan, how to wait, how to build connections, how to use patience instead of violence. His lessons weren't about escaping. They weren't about hurting officers. They were about preparing for life after prison, good or bad. Some men used his lessons to walk the right path when they got out. Others didn't. And that's where the danger started. Because inside Leavenworth, Harlan wasn't just teaching men how to survive. He was teaching them how to run operations. Real ones. Organized ones. Quiet ones. And officers started noticing something terrifying. Every major problem inside Leavenworth led back to men connected to Harlan. Even if he never touched anything himself. The key that shocked the prison. Remember that metal key found in the dirt during the hook? That key changed everything. Because when officers traced who had access to the woodshop that week, and who spoke with who, and who walked where, everything pointed back to one thing: a small group of men trained under Mr. Harlan's system. And that reality hit the staff like a punch. Leavenworth wasn't just holding criminals. It was accidentally helping create better ones. And the man behind it all was a quiet, calm, older inmate who never raised his voice. Mr. Harlan. The network that outsmarted the system. Leavenworth's officers always believed they were one step ahead. They had cameras. They had metal detectors. They had patrols that covered every corner, every hallway, every door. But Harlan's network didn't fight the system. They studied it. They memorized officer routines. They learned which cameras were old and had blind spots. They timed how long doors stayed open when food carts rolled through. They even knew which officers talked too much and revealed information without noticing. Bit by bit, Harlan students put the pieces together. Leavenworth officers realized they were dealing with something much bigger than regular inmate behavior. They were dealing with a system of organized intelligence. A system that grew every day. The map that shouldn't exist. It started with a discovery in a cell search. An officer found folded papers hidden inside a mattress. Not drawings. Not coded letters. Not gang messages. But a map of Leavenworth. Hand-drawn. Accurate. It had notes like, camera 7 delays 3 seconds. Door between kitchen and hallway stays open 12 seconds. Officer Townsend stops at this corner for 2 minutes. Blind spot near laundry bins. The officer who found it froze. This wasn't something a random inmate drew for fun. This was planning, study, observation. This was the kind of map made by people who weren't just surviving the prison. They were analyzing it. And when the officers traced the inmate who had the map, They discovered he had spent weeks working in different jobs. Library, kitchen, laundry, workshop. He wasn't picking random posts. He was collecting information. Information that fit perfectly into Harlan's rules. The communication system no one saw. Next, officers realized something else. Harlan's group didn't need phones. They didn't need notes. They didn't even need to talk much. They used a communication system that looked simple on the outside, but brilliant on the inside. A cough at the wrong time meant, stop talking. A shirt folded a certain way meant, officer coming. A towel placed on a bench meant, meeting later. Even the way they picked up a broom or set down a cup meant something. Tiny signals. Hidden messages. Nothing written. Nothing spoken. A system built on trust, memory, and training. The kind of communication used by professional organizations on the outside. And the scariest part? It was working. The new generation of learners. Not all inmates were part of Harlan's network. Most weren't. But the ones who were changed fast. Young offenders who used to act without thinking suddenly became calm. They weren't causing problems anymore. They were studying, watching, learning. One officer called them the quiet ones. But another officer gave them a different name. Harlan's class. These men weren't gangsters. They weren't violent. They weren't shouting or flexing. They were thinking, planning, and they were spreading what they learned to others in small, careful steps. A man who learned how to bypass a lock quietly taught 2 others. A man who learned how to manage money quietly explained it to someone else. A man who learned officer patterns whispered it to someone new on the tier. Every day the network grew. Not by shouting or force, but by education. When the warden realized the truth. The warden of Leavenworth had been warned before. Inmates are getting smarter. There's someone teaching them. This place feels different. But he didn't take it seriously until the key showed up. When he held that hand-shaped key in his hand, he understood something chilling. They weren't facing violent inmates. They were facing trained ones. And a trained mind is far more dangerous than a strong fist. He ordered full inspections. He increased patrols. He changed schedules. He added more cameras. But nothing he did stopped the quiet movement happening inside. Because Harlan's lessons were not about breaking rules. They were about understanding them. Understanding the system so well that you never had to get caught breaking it. And for the first time, the staff of Leavenworth wondered. Had the prison created the very thing it feared? A place where America's smartest criminals learned from each other. And left more prepared than they arrived? The answer was becoming clearer. But the story was far from over. The day everything changed. For months, Harlan's system grew quietly inside Leavenworth. Most officers didn't see the danger. Some noticed small hints, but nothing big enough to sound an alarm. But all of that changed on a cloudy morning that started like any other. Chow lines formed. Laundry carts rolled. Work crews moved through the halls. Everything looked normal. Until it wasn't. The missing tool. It began with a simple report from the workshop. A tool was missing. Not a big one. Not a dangerous one. Just a small precision file, thin, sharp, perfect for shaping metal. At first, officers thought it was misplaced. Tools disappear sometimes. They show up later. But not this time. When they checked the sign-in sheets and the list of inmates who worked that morning, one name stood out. A young inmate known for being one of Harlan's quiet learners. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He didn't break rules. He studied. And that made officers nervous. The strange behavior in the yard. At yard time, officers saw something even stranger. 3 inmates, Reyes, Curtis, and a man known as Little Tone, stood at one of the far benches. These men were from different backgrounds and different states. Normally, they stayed in their own groups. But today, they were together, talking quietly, heads close, hands hidden under the table. The officer watching them recognized the pattern. It was the same behavior described in reports about Harlan's students. Before he could walk over, the 3 men separated like nothing had happened. Curtis stretched his arms. Little Tone walked to the pull-up bar. Reyes sat alone, staring at the ground. Something was being planned. But nobody knew what. The discovery in the trash room. Later that day, a janitor working near the trash compactor called officers over. He'd found something hidden behind a stack of old boxes. A metal bar. Thin. Shiny. Freshly filed at the edges. Not a weapon, but a tool. The piece of something bigger. And next to it, in the dust, were tiny metal shavings. Proof that somewhere inside Leavenworth, someone was shaping metal recently. Officers searched the area. Nothing else was found. But the janitor whispered something that made their stomach twist. I heard scraping, like metal on metal. Few nights ago. Around 2 a.m. The officers checked the logbook. There was only one inmate assigned to trash duty that night. The warden's emergency meeting. By evening, panic spread through the administration. The warden called all senior officers into his office. On the table he placed 3 items. The missing precision file. The metal bar found behind the trash boxes. And the handmade key discovered earlier in the dirt. Then he placed photos of the inmates rumored to be learning under Harlan. Curtis. Little Tone. Lewis. 5 men. Different backgrounds. Different crimes. But all connected quietly. This is not random, the warden said. This is organized. He was right. But he still didn't understand how deep the network truly ran. The search that shook the prison. Officers stormed the cells of every inmate connected to Harlan. They searched mattresses, laundry bags, toothbrushes, furniture. And what they found didn't look like tools or weapons. It looked like education. Stacks of notes on officer routines. Hand-drawn sketches of buildings. Lists of supply schedules. Names of inmates who worked in specific areas. Pages copied from financial books. Step-by-step instructions for filing paperwork. Even small journals filled with observations. This wasn't a gang. This wasn't a riot plan. This wasn't an escape. This was something far more controlled. A curriculum. A structured, organized system of learning. A system that taught inmates how to think, how to analyze, and how to move in ways most criminals never learned. And at the center of it all, sat one name. Written again and again on slips of paper. Harlan. Not as a leader. Not as a boss. But as a teacher. The final shock of the day. As officers ended their searches, a rookie guard noticed something strange. In the middle of the yard, a small folded paper stuck under a rock. He opened it. Inside were 3 words. Class meets tonight. No names. No details. No instructions. Just that. 3 words that proved something terrifying. No matter how much the prison searched, no matter how many tools they confiscated, no matter how many inmates they questioned, the network was still active, still learning, still growing, still planning. And Harlan? He sat in his cell reading a book, as calm as ever, as if nothing happening around him mattered. But the truth was simple. Everything happening around him started with him. The quiet power of Harlan. Night fell over Leavenworth, and everything felt heavier than usual. The officers were on edge. The inmates were whispering. And deep inside the cell blocks, something was happening. Something nobody could fully see. But one thing was clear. Harlan wasn't worried. While officers tore apart cells and yelled orders, he sat on his bunk calmly turning the pages of an old paperback. He didn't look stressed. He didn't look scared. He looked like a man who already knew the ending to a story everyone else was just beginning. The cell that held no secrets, but held everything. During the searches earlier, officers saved Harlan's cell for last. They expected to find maps, notes, tools, messages, something big. Instead, nothing. The folded uniform, a single pen, Bible, 3 worn-out books, a small plastic cup, a pair of reading glasses. No secret compartments. No coded letters. No papers hidden in the mattress. Nothing illegal. But the officers overlooked something vital. Harlan never kept anything for himself. He didn't write notes. He didn't hide maps. He didn't make tools. He taught others to do it. That was his genius. His mind held the plans. His students carried them out. Finding nothing in his cell frustrated officers even more, because it meant they couldn't stop something they couldn't physically see. Harlan's power wasn't muscle, it was memory. Every inmate in Harlan's circle carried a little piece of his knowledge. One inmate knew officer patterns. Another knew camera blind spots. Another knew woodworking. Another knew finances. Another knew cleaning schedules. None of them alone had everything. But when they stood together, they were one complete system, a living machine. And Harlan? He was the engine. The night meeting. That night, while the prison quieted down after lockdown, something subtle happened in the dark. 3 soft knocks. Fuzz. 2 knocks. Fuzz. 1 knock. It was a signal. Inside the cells on Tier C, inmates slowly sat up. Not all of them, just the ones who knew the pattern. Fuzz. Curtis. Lewis. Little Tone. They didn't speak. They didn't move out of their cells. They didn't pass notes. They simply listened. Because from down the tier, through the silence, came a single whisper. Lesson isn't over. No name attached. No orders. No plans. Just a sentence that told them everything. The search hadn't stopped the network. The confiscations hadn't slowed it. The officers hadn't broken anything. They'd confirmed the network was working. Harlan wasn't afraid. So neither were his students. The warden can't sleep. Across the compound in his office, the warden stared at cameras that showed nothing but darkness and stillness. To him, the prison looked peaceful. But he knew better. His biggest fear wasn't riots, or fights, or escape attempts. It was intelligence, quiet intelligence, organized intelligence. And Harlan's group had all 3. These weren't men banging on doors. These were thinkers. The warden rubbed his eyes and whispered to himself. Where did this start? How deep is it? And how do we stop a problem we can't see? He had no idea what the biggest question really was. Could Leavenworth even be stopped from teaching men how to outsmart it? Harlan speaks. For the first time in days, Harlan finally opened his mouth. Not to an inmate, but to an officer. Officer Daniels, a younger guard, paused in front of his cell. He stared at Harlan, unsure whether to speak or move on. And in that moment, Harlan said something that chilled him. You're searching for the wrong thing. Daniels frowned. What does that mean? Harlan closed his book slowly. You look for tools. You look for notes. You look for plans. He tapped his temple. The real danger lives in the mind. Daniels stepped back, unsettled. Not by the words themselves, but by how calmly Harlan said them. Like a teacher explaining something simple to a confused student. The prison realizes the truth. By sunrise, officers finally understood. They weren't just dealing with inmates who were learning skills. They were dealing with a philosophy, a mindset, a system of thinking that couldn't be found by searching cells or confiscating scraps. Harlan had taught men something far more powerful than how to file metal or read bank statements. He taught them how to see the world differently. How to see prison differently. How to think ahead. And once a mind learns to think in new ways, you can't undo that. Leavenworth had become a machine that taught criminals to become smarter. And the smartest man in the building was still teaching. Quietly. Calmly. Unstoppable. The test of loyalty. Morning came with a strange tension in the air. Officers walked the tiers with stiff shoulders. Inmates spoke in low tones. Even the usual morning clatter in the chow hall felt quieter, tighter, controlled. Everyone sensed it. A breaking point was coming. Not a riot. Not an escape. Something different. Something built on intelligence, not chaos. And it began with a single moment in the chow line. The chow hall incident. Reyes stood in line for breakfast, oatmeal, a banana, and a stale biscuit. Nothing unusual. But then an officer at the front of the line yelled, "Curtis! Step out! Bag check!" Curtis froze. He looked calm, but inside he knew what this meant. Officers suspected him of being part of Harlan's inner circle. They were testing him now. Reyes watched carefully as Curtis stepped aside, placing his tray on the metal counter. The officer opened the bag Curtis carried from his cleaning shift. He shook it out. A few rags fell to the floor. Nothing else. But the officer wasn't satisfied. What were you doing yesterday near the workshop? Curtis didn't blink. Cleaning the hallway, sir. What were you whispering about in the yard? Talking about sports. What do you know about the metal bar we found? No idea what you're talking about. The officer stared into his eyes for a long moment. And Curtis didn't break. Not a twitch. Not a tremble. Reyes swallowed hard. This was the test. The test of loyalty. Not to Harlan, but to the system they were building. Curtis passed. The prison's reaction. Word traveled fast. By lunchtime, every connected inmate knew Curtis had been interrogated. And he said nothing. Reyes glanced across the yard. Little Tone nodded at Curtis. Lewis gave him a small thumbs up. Even Dre, who rarely talked, tapped his hand twice on the bench, a sign of respect. But the most important reaction came from Harlan himself. As Curtis walked past Harlan's cell later that afternoon, Harlan didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't even look directly at Curtis. He simply closed his book and gave one slow nod. That nod was worth more than any words. Commit. You're one of us now. You understand the rules. You think with the group, not alone. And that scared the officers more than anything else. Because every time they pushed, Harlan's network grew stronger. The warden takes action. That evening, the warden made a bold decision. He gathered his deputy wardens and said, "We break them apart. We separate Harlan's men. Different units. Different blocks. Different jobs. Total isolation from each other." It sounded simple. Standard. Effective. Except, they didn't understand the truth yet. Harlan didn't need men to stand together. He didn't need meetings. He didn't need shared jobs. He didn't need notes or tools or direct contact. He trained minds, not bodies. And minds can't be separated by doors. Still, the prison moved fast. Reyes was moved to Unit E. Curtis to Unit B. Lewis to Unit D. Little Tone to Unit F. Dre to Unit C. Harlan himself was moved to an isolation cell. The prison believed they'd broken the network. But they had only forced it to evolve. The message that shouldn't have been possible. 2 days after the separation, Reyes found something hidden inside his folded laundry, right under his jumper, tucked between the sleeves. A small scrap of paper. No handwriting. Just 3 tiny symbols drawn with a dull pencil. A circle. A triangle. A square. Reyes stared at it, heart pounding. He understood instantly. Circle equals Reyes. Triangle equals Curtis. Square equals Lewis. 3 shapes. 3 roles. 3 positions. Commit. Still connected. Still active. Still thinking. But how did this message reach Reyes? He had new laundry workers. New officers. New cellmates. No one from Harlan's group was near him. Which meant only one thing. The network was bigger than anyone thought. Other inmates, men who weren't part of the class, were now helping spread the messages. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Harlan's ideas were spreading across Leavenworth. Quietly. Smoothly. Unstoppable. The moment that shocked Reyes. That night, as Reyes sat on his bunk staring at the shapes, he heard a soft voice from the next cell. "You got the message, right?" Reyes froze. It was a man he didn't know. A man he'd never spoken to. A man who wasn't part of Harlan's core group. "How do you know about that?" Reyes whispered. The man chuckled softly. "Harlan teaches all of us one way or another. We just pass it on." Reyes realized the truth. This wasn't a small network anymore. It was a mindset spreading through the prison like wildfire. Even men who weren't in Harlan's circle were becoming part of something larger. A system of shared knowledge. Shared techniques. Shared thinking. Students teaching students. A chain reaction. The prison believed they broke the network. But they'd only made it grow wider, deeper, smarter. And Leavenworth had no idea what was coming next. The blueprint of a new breed. Days passed, and Leavenworth seemed calm on the surface. But only on the surface. Beneath the routine, beneath the silence, beneath the strict schedules, something new was forming. Not a gang. Not a crew. Not a rebellion. A network of thinkers. Harlan's influence was no longer limited to 5 or 6 men. It had spread like ink on paper, quiet, steady, unstoppable. Inmates from different units, different races, and different pasts were suddenly acting with the same discipline, the same focus, the same purpose. And the officers didn't even see it happening. The blueprint with no paper. Reyes sat in his new cell one afternoon, staring at the wall, when a realization hit him. Everything Harlan taught wasn't about tools or tricks. It wasn't about metal keys or secret maps. Those things were just pieces, small pieces. The real blueprint was invisible. It lived in how the men walked, how they observed, how they made decisions, how they shared information, how they avoided attention, how they thought like a unit. This was more than criminal education. It was order, a kind of mental discipline that made the inmates think like chess players instead of checkers players. Moves ahead, never reacting, always planning. Reyes understood now why Harlan never panicked. You can take a man's tools, but you can't take a man's mind once it has changed. A new kind of trouble. One night, a loud shouting match broke out in Unit B. 2 inmates were nose to nose, fists clenched, ready to fight. Officers rushed toward them. But before they arrived, something strange happened. A third inmate calmly stepped between the 2 angry men and whispered something only they could hear. The 2 stopped, took a breath, backed away. Fight over. No punches. No threats. No gang orders. The officers were confused. The inmate who broke up the fight wasn't a gang leader. He wasn't big or strong. He was one of Harlan's quiet observers. Another student. The officers didn't know it, but behind that small moment was one of Harlan's oldest lessons. Violence attracts attention. Smart men use quiet. The officers make a terrible assumption. The next day, the deputy warden reported. It's working. The separation slowed them down. Everyone in the room nodded. But they were wrong. So wrong. What the officers saw as calm was actually strategy. What they saw as compliance was actually coordination. Because even with distance between them, Harlan students were moving like a single brain split into pieces. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need to meet. Their minds had been trained the same way. Like soldiers in different parts of a battlefield, who still follow the same plan. The new students. Harlan's original 5 students were still important. Reyes learned observation. Curtis learned timing. Lewis learned financial thinking. Dre learned patterns and schedules. Little Tone learned stealth. But now, new students were rising. Men who had never spoken to Harlan directly. Men who learned the techniques by watching others. This new generation didn't need Harlan to teach them face to face. They were learning from Reyes. Learning from Curtis. Learning from Dre. And each new student became another branch of the growing network. Leavenworth, without realizing it, had become a school with hundreds of classrooms, all teaching the same subject. How to think like a strategist. The message that shocked the prison officer. One evening, Officer Daniels, the same guard who had spoken to Harlan earlier, found a folded piece of plastic on the floor near his station. At first, he thought it was trash. But when he opened it, his hands shook. Inside were 3 words. We're still learning. No threats. No demands. Just a simple statement. A statement that proved something terrifying. The network wasn't hidden anymore. It wasn't small. It wasn't afraid. It was confident, growing, focused. And Daniels realized something no one else in the administration had understood yet. This wasn't about escape. This wasn't about breaking the prison. This was about becoming smarter inside it. Smarter than officers. Smarter than systems. Smarter than anyone expected. Leavenworth wasn't just failing to stop the network. Leavenworth was building it. And deep inside his isolation cell, Harlan closed his eyes with a calm breath. Not because he was in control of everything, but because he knew one truth. Once a mind learns to see differently, it never goes back. The event that revealed everything. Days passed with an eerie calm. Leavenworth looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. But anyone who understood prisons knew the truth. Silence is never just silence. Silence is pressure. Silence is build-up. Silence means something is coming. That something arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, quietly, suddenly, and in a way no one expected. The broken camera. Officer Daniels was doing his usual rotation when he noticed something strange on the security monitor. Camera 14, covering the hallway near the vocational workshop, was showing a frozen image. Static. Glitched. Stuck on a still frame. He frowned. Camera 14 wasn't an old one. It never glitched. Ever. He called it in. Control, I'm seeing interference on 14. Check the feed. Control replied. Confirmed. System is rebooting. But it wasn't. Something was wrong. Daniels leaned closer, studying the screen. The frozen image showed the hallway completely empty. But Daniels had been walking past that hallway just moments before. There were inmates there. 3 of them. Pushing a cart. Why were they missing from the feed? He felt his stomach tighten. This was a malfunction. This was manipulation. The cart that shouldn't be there. Daniels rushed toward the hallway near the workshop. When he got there, the cart he expected to find was still in the hall. But something was off. The cart wasn't the one used by the custodial crew. It was a kitchen cart. It shouldn't have been anywhere near this wing. He moved closer. On the bottom shelf, half covered by rags, he saw something small and shiny. A filed bolt. A tool piece. His breath caught. This is coordinated, he whispered. Just like the missing file. Just like the metal scrap behind the trash bins. Just like the key in the dirt. All pieces. Pieces of something bigger. The message scratched into the wall. Then Daniels saw something else. On the wall near the workshop door, so faint it was almost invisible, someone had scratched a symbol into the paint. A triangle. The same symbol Curtis represented in the coded message. That wasn't graffiti. It was communication. A quiet signal to the network. Phase complete. For the first time, Daniels understood that these symbols weren't random shapes. They were the network's alphabet. Circle. Triangle. Positions. Roles. Steps. This wasn't a gang. This wasn't a rebellion. This was a blueprint. A blueprint made of shared knowledge, signals, and invisible coordination. A blueprint Harlan had designed. The search for Curtis. Daniels called for Curtis to be located immediately. Officers checked his unit. He wasn't there. Checked the library. Not there. Checked the rec area. Not there either. Panic rose. Curtis wasn't missing. No inmate could just disappear. But he was not where he was assigned to be, and that was enough to trigger alarms. The warden was alerted. Search teams spread out. But Daniels paused. He remembered one of Harlan's early lessons to his students. Real moves don't happen in the loud places. They happen in the quiet ones. So Daniels made a guess. He went to the one place officers rarely checked during afternoon routines. The storage room behind the workshop. He pushed open the metal door. And froze. Curtis was there, but he wasn't alone. Inside the small, dim room stood Curtis. And 2 other inmates from completely different housing units. Men who had never been seen associating with each other before. Men who weren't supposed to be anywhere near this room. On the floor between them was a folded towel. Inside the towel? Small metal pieces. Not weapons. Not fully formed tools. Components. Ships. Unfinished pieces that could be assembled into something later. The inmates didn't panic. They didn't run. They didn't fight. They simply looked at Daniels with calm eyes. As if they expected him. As if they had been waiting to see how far the officers had caught on. Curtis spoke first. "We aren't doing what you think." Daniels stepped forward slowly. "What are you doing?" Curtis answered with the same quiet confidence Harlan always had. "Learning." The realization that changed everything. As officers cuffed the 3 inmates and took them away, Daniels stared down at the metal pieces. Suddenly, he understood. These men weren't building an escape device. They weren't sabotaging the prison. They were practicing, training, developing skills, measuring precision, studying designs, applying what Harlan taught them. They weren't making a plan for today. They were developing knowledge for the future. A future outside. A future inside. A future wherever their minds would take them. This wasn't about Leavenworth. It was about graduation. Because Leavenworth wasn't a prison anymore. It was a school producing organized, intelligent, disciplined criminals. The kind who could run real operations the moment they hit the streets. Daniels whispered to himself. Harlan isn't teaching them to escape. He's teaching them to evolve. And he wasn't wrong. Not even close. The prison thought separating them would break the network. But what they didn't understand was simple. You cannot break an idea once it has taken root. And in Leavenworth, Harlan's idea had already grown into something huge. Something powerful. Something the prison officers were only beginning to understand. The man who saw too much. Officer Daniels didn't sleep that night. He sat in his small staff apartment just outside the prison gates, staring at the wall, replaying every detail he'd seen. The glitched camera, the misplaced cart, the scratch symbol, the metal components in the storage room, the calm confidence of Curtis. But the thing haunting him most wasn't what he saw. It was what it meant. For the first time, Daniels understood. Leavenworth wasn't producing criminals. It was perfecting them. And Harlan wasn't just creating smarter inmates. He was creating leaders. The warden's denial. The next morning, Daniels approached the warden with everything he had found. He explained the symbols. He explained the coordinated movements. He explained how the inmates weren't building weapons. They were developing skills. Skills that would make them dangerous long after release. The warden listened. And then shook his head. You're overthinking it, he said. 3 inmates in a storage room isn't a conspiracy. Daniels tried again. Sir, this isn't about tools. It's about training. Harlan has created a system. The warden cut him off. Harlan is an old man in an isolation cell. He has 0 influence now. Daniels knew the truth. Harlan didn't need physical access to influence anything. His teachings had already spread across the prison like a silent wildfire. But the warden refused to believe it. And that ignorance would cost the prison everything. The return of the symbols. That same afternoon, Daniels walked the tiers alone, looking for anything suspicious. And he found it. On a food tray in Unit F, scratched into the plastic. A square. On a broom handle in Unit D, burned lightly into the wood. A triangle. On a bathroom mirror in Unit E, drawn faintly with soap. A circle. 3 symbols. 3 confirmations. 3 signs that the network was still moving, still thinking, still teaching. Even after the arrests. Even after the searches. Even after Harlan's isolation. Daniels whispered, they're still active and they're everywhere. The conversation that explained everything. Later that night, Daniels walked past Harlan's isolation cell. Harlan sat on the edge of his bunk, glasses low on his nose, reading the same worn-out book he always read. Daniels stopped outside the bars. You caused this, Daniels said quietly. Harlan didn't look up. Instead, he marked his page with a small slip of toilet paper and folded the book closed. Then he stood and approached the bars, face calm, eyes steady. Tell me, Harlan said softly, what exactly do you think I caused? Daniels hesitated. You taught them. You organized them. You made them smarter than the system. Harlan studied Daniels with a slow, thoughtful expression. You think intelligence is a crime? He asked. No, Daniels said. But teaching men how to manipulate a prison is. Harlan gave a slight smile. Officer, I didn't teach them how to manipulate the prison. I taught them how to understand it. And that's worse, Daniels replied. Harlan leaned in closer. People fear what they don't control. And in this place, you officers don't control very much anymore. A chill ran down Daniels' spine. Because it wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was simply the truth. The moment Daniels realized the scale. As Daniels walked away from the isolation block, he passed by various units. In Unit C, 2 inmates traded positions in line without speaking. A silent signal. In Unit E, an inmate paused at a corner for exactly 3 seconds before turning. A timed movement. In Unit A, a man placed his shoes under his bed facing outward instead of inward. A coded message. These weren't coincidences. They were patterns. Patterns belonging to a system. A system of hundreds. Daniels finally understood. Harlan didn't build a group. He built an ideology. A way of thinking. A discipline. Something that could spread without him ever speaking another word. Something that couldn't be stopped by isolation, officers, or rules. Something Leavenworth had unknowingly helped create. A blueprint for a new breed of criminal. Calm, organized, methodical, strategic. Criminals who would leave prison not broken, but sharpened. The warden's biggest mistake. That night, the warden signed a transfer request. He wanted Harlan moved to a federal supermax facility thousands of miles away. He thought distancing Harlan would shut down the network permanently. But he didn't understand the most important truth in the entire prison. You cannot transfer a mindset. You cannot relocate a blueprint. And you cannot move what has already spread. Harlan leaving wouldn't end the network. It would ignite it. Because the students were now teachers. And the teachers were now leaders. Leavenworth was no longer a prison. It had become a factory, producing America's most patient, disciplined, and organized criminal minds. A quiet machine hidden behind stone walls. And it was still running. The transfer that backfired. The day of Harlan's transfer arrived before sunrise. The sky was still dark, the air cold, and a thin fog hung across the yard like a warning. Officers moved with urgency. Extra guards, extra gear, extra caution. It felt like they were transporting a violent kingpin. Not an older man with gray hair and calm eyes. But deep down, the staff knew this wasn't an ordinary inmate. Harlan was an idea. And ideas are dangerous. The silent walk. 2 officers entered his isolation cell. Harlan, stand up. Hands behind your back. Harlan didn't resist. Didn't argue. Didn't even ask where he was going. He simply stood, turned, and allowed the cuffs to click onto his wrists. As they walked him down the tier, inmates across the block fell silent. Not one word. Not one shout. Not one sound of disrespect or fear. Just silence. A heavy silence. A silence that said, the teacher is leaving, but the class is still in session. For the officers, that silence was far more terrifying than anger. The look from Reyes. When Harlan passed Unit E, the floor where Reyes had been moved, Reyes stepped close to the bars. Their eyes met for the first time in weeks. Harlan gave him a small look. Not a nod. Not a smile. Just a look that carried a message Reyes understood instantly. Your turn now. Reyes exhaled. His mind sharpened. The torch had been passed. Not through words. Not through meetings. But through responsibility. The network didn't die today. It evolved. The bus ride out of Leavenworth. Harlan was placed into a transport bus with 2 armed escorts and a driver. As the bus pulled away from the gates, the warden stepped outside his office to watch. He exhaled deeply, almost relieved. It's over, he whispered. Officer Daniels stood behind him and said nothing. Because Daniels knew the truth. Nothing was over. Everything was beginning. Back inside the prison, something shifted. The moment the bus disappeared down the road, the inmates moved. Not loudly. Not violently. But with precision. In Unit D, Lewis sat at a table and began drawing numbers. Not illegal numbers, just sequences, patterns, observations. Training material. In Unit B, Curtis quietly taught 2 younger inmates how to recognize officer habits. Where they looked. Where they didn't. How they walked. How they hesitated. In Unit F, Little Tone practiced bending small pieces of cardboard into tiny shapes, mimicking the same motor skills he once used in the workshop. In Unit C, Dre silently timed his tiers routine down to the second, memorizing every officer's shift change without writing a single thing down. In Unit E, Reyes sat at the edge of his bunk. He realized something important. The network didn't fall apart when they got separated. It grew sharper, more independent, more resilient. Harlan had not built followers. He had built thinkers. And thinkers don't need a leader standing beside them. The warden celebrates too soon. By noon, the warden held a short meeting. Gentlemen, he said proudly, Harlan is no longer our problem. Some officers clapped. Some nodded. Some looked relieved. Only Daniels kept his arms crossed, eyes unfocused, mind racing. Because he saw what the warden could not. Harlan was only one part of a much larger system. And systems survive even when parts are removed. Daniels finally spoke. Sir, with all respect, moving him won't stop what he taught. The room fell silent. The warden frowned. What exactly do you think he taught them? Daniels took a slow breath. The same thing every school teaches. How to learn. How to adapt. How to think for themselves. He paused. And once a man learns that, you can't undo it. But the warden didn't believe him. And that denial opened the door for what came next. The first sign of a new order. That night, during final count, Officer Daniels noticed something unusual. 3 inmates from completely different units, men who were never housed together, performed the exact same motion at the exact same second. They placed their cups upside down on the metal table. 1 in Unit C. 1 in Unit F. 1 in Unit A. Different buildings. Different officers watching. Same motion. Same timing. It wasn't a coincidence. It was communication. A new network signal. A sign that the system lived on. Stronger than before. A sign that the students were now guiding each other. A sign that Leavenworth now had something far more dangerous than a leader. A shared mindset. Collective intelligence. A movement. And Harlan? He wasn't gone. He was simply no longer needed inside those walls. Because Leavenworth had already become what he envisioned. A training ground. A silent university. The birthplace of America's smartest criminal minds. And it was still evolving. The graduation no one saw coming. Harlan's transfer didn't break Leavenworth. It activated it. Within days, the prison ran on a new rhythm. Quiet, controlled, disciplined. Not because someone ordered it, but because the inmates were thinking differently now. It showed in everything. In how they walked. In how they observed. In how they communicated without speaking. In how they studied officer movements without getting caught. In how they shared lessons through tiny gestures. The network wasn't a group anymore. It had become a culture. A way of understanding prison. A way of understanding power. A way of understanding the world. And even the officers who refused to believe it felt the shift. They saw fewer fights. Fewer arguments. Less chaos. At first, they thought it was improvement. But what they didn't realize was chilling. Silence wasn't peace. Silence was strategy. Every inmate who had learned from Harlan, directly or indirectly, was honing their mind. Preparing for the day they stepped outside those razor wire walls. Not to become violent criminals. Not to start wars. But to run things. Smart, quiet, organized. Just like Harlan taught. The day Reyes became what Harlan always saw in him. Weeks later, during afternoon yard time, Reyes walked to the far bench, the same one where he had once watched Harlan's original circle gather. He sat down, hands clasped, eyes scanning the yard. Lewis approached. Curtis followed. Dre stopped beside him. Little Tone leaned against the bench. No one spoke. But the formation said everything. Reyes wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the oldest. But he was the one Harlan had chosen with that final look. A look that said, "You think now. You lead now." For the first time, Reyes understood what Harlan had been building all along. Not soldiers. Not criminals. Not rebels. Thinkers. Planners. Architects. And this quiet moment, was their graduation. Not with caps and gowns. Not with applause. But with silence. Unity. Purpose. The prison couldn't stop it. They couldn't control it. Because Harlan hadn't built an organization. He built a generation. Tying everything together. Leavenworth was never meant to be what it became. It was supposed to break men. To control them. To contain them. It sharpened them. Inside those massive stone walls, something unexpected was born. A silent university. A school of strategy. A breeding ground for minds that refused to stay small. And Harlan, the quiet old man they believed they defeated by transferring him, never needed to be inside the prison anymore. because his lessons lived on in every corner of Leavenworth. In the symbols scratched on walls, in the timed movements, in the silent signals, in the discipline of men who once acted on impulse, but now moved with intention. These weren't the criminals America expected. They were the criminals America created, shaped by a system they were never meant to understand as deeply as they did. The system Harlan taught them to study, to decode, to predict, to think. And the scariest truth? A mind sharpened inside these walls will still be sharp when it walks out. Leavenworth didn't just house America's criminal elite. It trained them, refined them, graduated them, and the world outside had no idea what was coming. If you found this story gripping and eye-opening, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to InsidePrisonWalls 1, where the truth can't be locked away. Your support helps expose the untold stories hidden behind prison walls.